Good evening. Thank you for joining us. Thank you all for coming out. What a crowd for this very small and warm space. We are delighted to have you all with us. Welcome to the Heller Center and for our invited lecture this evening with Professor Aaron Griffith, as sponsored by the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism. We really appreciate you joining us. Following Professor Griffith's lecture this evening, there will be an open Q&A. We invite you to speak up and participate in the small space we are in, after which we will also be holding a small book signing out here in our front hall. Professor Griffith has brought some copies of his book to sell to you at a reasonable market rate. And I want to also thank the Henry Luce Foundation, whose generous support has helped found the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and inaugurate this lecture series on cultures of evangelicalism, past and present. I wish to recognize our director, Jeffrey Scholes, and associate directors Paul Harvey and George Bayuga, all the way back there, whose presence today helps us see why this center is so needed in this moment in our nation's history as we seek to understand this moment and invest in the hard work of collective memory and knowledge production that will help shape our future generations to come. Now more than ever, we need the resources and tools and infrastructures of understanding that scholarship provides and our community furnishes. I wish to recognize the incredible generosity of our community, including an amazing anonymous matching donation of $15,000 that we invite you to realize by sharing whatever gift, no matter how small, knowing it will be doubled to help us ensure this center and its work can live on for generations to come. Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our director, Professor Jeffrey Scholes, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Ben. Can you all hear me okay? I can't hear. Is it projecting? Good, okay. Thank you all for being here. What a wonderful turnout. Very excited for the event, Crime, Punishment, and Evangelicalism, an evening with Aaron Griffith. We're thrilled to have Aaron here. He'll be speaking in a minute. My name is Jeff Scholes. I'm chair of the philosophy department here as well. There's some faculty members from our department here. Thank you for being here, in particular Dr. Sassauer, who's helped me tremendously. I want to say a couple things about this center that we started last year, and then I'll introduce Aaron. This center, as Ben alluded to, is funded primarily by this Luce grant that we received last year. And a big part of it, although not all of it, is dedicated to the development of the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism. And the genesis of it really born out of conversations with Paul Harvey and I, Paul in the history department, about a need for a center like this. There is not one in the country that we could find. There used to be one, but as of about 11 years ago, there is not one anymore. And given the political landscape and climate in the United States, and the role of evangelicalism that has been shown through polling data and other indicators, the importance of the study of evangelicalism, and what better place to study it than at Colorado Springs, at a public university as well. The other previous centers that had been in existence were at religious universities, but at a state university, ideally there's a kind of trust in the way in which we're going to examine and analyze evangelicalism. So there's a scholarly portion. Certainly we're at a university for the center, but the other part of it is the community part of it. I mean, part of the mission of being at a public university is to engage the community. It's a part of the mission. We want to, but we also have no choice. But with a topic like evangelicalism here in Colorado Springs, it's absolutely necessary. And it's not just we bring scholars to come in and talk to you. We desire to hear from you as well. And we had a big community event a couple weeks ago, strictly run by community members about kind of ex-evangelicalism, those who have left the evangelical church, and we'll continue to have events like that. And we take suggestions as well on aspects of evangelicalism that you'd like to hear about that are either going on in the community, or in the country, or globally. So anyway, thank you so much for being here. I think Ben kind of laid out the structure of the event, so we'll get to the introduction to Aaron's talk. Aaron Griffith is assistant professor of American Church History at Duke Divinity School. His work focuses on evangelicalism, religion in American politics, and religion and criminal justice. He has published articles in journals such as Religions and Fides as Historia, and he writes regularly for popular audiences in publications such as Time, Christianity Today, and Religion and Politics. His book, God's Law and Order, The Politics of Punishment in Evangelical America, was published in 2020 by Harvard University Press and won the 2022 Best Book in History and Biography Award from Christianity Today. He's currently at work on a book on the religious history of American policing. So please join me in welcoming Aaron Griffith to the stage.
Thank you so much for having me here. This is really fun. Small room. This is great. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to speak to you, and I'm really, it's just been such a wonderful time already here in Colorado Springs. I want to thank Ben for his work in organizing and making this happen. And I want to thank Paul, Jeff, and George for their work in getting this center off the ground. I think it's fantastic that this center now exists, and I'm so excited to see the kinds of events, engagement that y'all do in the future. So really excited about this. I want to begin my talk by discussing some relatively recent moments that I think are helpful entry points into the history that I want to chart with you this evening. So 5 years ago, in 2020, protests erupted in cities nationwide in the aftermath of the highly publicized killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other Black Americans by police. These were protests not only of these deaths and of police brutality, but of decades of law enforcement policies and practices that have resulted in millions of Americans being locked up, disproportionately the poor and people of color. The United States locks up more people per capita than any nation in the world, with nearly 2 million people confined in prisons, jails, and other detention facilities nationwide. This incarcerated population grew rapidly over the past 40 years, from the 1970s on, a 500% increase to today. The number of Black Americans behind bars is even more dramatic. Though they make up only 14% of the total U.S. population, Black Americans make up 41% of the incarcerated population. When people talk about and protest mass incarceration, as they did in 2020, this is the kind of stuff they're focused on. Massive numbers of people, disproportionately poor and people of color, behind bars, and tremendous growth in a relatively short amount of time in our nation's history as a result of changes in law, sentencing practices, and policing and prosecution strategies. And many Christians around the world joined in these protests, pointing out the need for the nation to reckon with its sins of racism and overcriminalization. After all, Jesus' own message, as the scripture mentioned here on this sign from the Gospel of Luke says, was to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and to set the oppressed free. But other forms of Christian messaging on policing and incarceration were in play in 2020 as well. In the midst of these same protests, President Donald Trump went to St. John's Church near the White House and posed for photos with a Bible in his hand. Just before this photo op, law enforcement brutally cleared peaceful protesters and press who were camped in nearby Lafayette Park. President Trump defended the photo op by pointing to his religious supporters. He said, "Most religious leaders loved it, and right now I think the nation needs more law and order." For the Bible-wielding President Trump and many of his vocal followers, Christianity and law and order were linked. And this was a message Trump continued to hammer home, especially in the most recent presidential election. However, Trump's messaging on criminal justice and Christianity went deeper than a straightforward punitive appeal in two respects. First, at the same time he blasted attempts to defund police departments and declared himself the law and order candidate, Trump also spoke of reform and redemption. Throughout the 2020 campaign, though less so in 2024, Trump hailed his criminal justice reform record, such as his passage of 2018's First Step Act legislation, which was praised by many Christians and passed in no small part due to the lobbying of evangelical Christian justice reformers. In 2020, Trump held a televised pardon ceremony for John Ponder, a former bank robber who had committed his life to Christ while in prison through listening to the evangelist Billy Graham on the radio. Ponder's testimony and his pardon was, as Trump called it, a beautiful testament to the power of redemption. Second, though Trump's Bible-wielding St. John's photo op puzzled many observers, this was not an appeal outside the mainstream of modern American politics. Polling in the midst of these protests showed that nearly 2/3 of Americans said that maintaining law and order was a major problem in this country. And Trump's calls for law and order were a culmination of longer bipartisan trends. For instance, in the mid-1990s, there were few politicians more committed to law and order than Delaware Senator Joe Biden, who as a presidential candidate and as president also rejected calls to defund police or dramatically challenge the operation of the nation's criminal justice system, despite some last-minute clemencies issued in the final days of his presidency. And though Vice President Kamala Harris was critiqued as being too soft on crime by Trump, her campaign continually ran ads that pointed to her prosecutorial experience and her work putting the bad guys behind bars. In sum, law and order politicking is not an aberration in modern American political history. Law and order was a slogan mobilized throughout the 20th century by Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, and liberals, all of whom saw it as a mainstream issue of concern and a phrase with profound political power. Indeed, Trump and his Republican allies mobilized moments like the First Step Act as a way to diffuse criticism that his vision of Republican law and order was racist, and to paint former law and order Democrats like Biden as the true architects of mass incarceration. So moments like these are emblematic of the long history, the long complicated history, of the ways evangelical Christians have shaped and interacted with modern American criminal justice, and of the ways concerns about crime and punishment in turn shaped American evangelical identity. Starting in the early 20th century and moving up to the recent past, I want to present 3 arguments about this history that I think can help us make sense of recent moments like these, and hopefully can illuminate our understanding of the contemporary realities of American criminal justice, mass incarceration, and evangelical engagement therein. In this talk, I'm going to draw on my own research on the history of American religion and criminal justice, both from my book, God's Law and Order, as well as my current research on the religious history of American policing. So, with that, my first argument. Concerns about crime and social disorder and the corresponding retributive, tough-on-crime responses in modern American history have long had a distinctly religious quality. In particular, they have been animated by and oriented to conservative, revivalist Protestant Christians, or for the sake of my talk today, who I'm calling evangelicals. We can talk about what's an evangelical later if you want. That's what I'm calling them. Often the history of evangelical involvement in modern American public life is narrated with reference to religious debates and divisions over classic culture war issues, such as abortion, civil rights, communism. But we should attend to the ways concerns about lawbreaking and crime were also sites of religious debates, and how fear of crime and interest in punishment motivated many Christians, especially evangelicals, to engage politically. Here are 2 sets of examples. The first comes from the early 20th century. Around this time, there was the beginning of an expanded national vision of policy and public opinion on the need to fight crime. Crime rates had risen as more people migrated into crowded urban neighborhoods in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and politicians began to deliver public appeals on the need for more law and order and launched several policy broadsides against crime that modernized law enforcement efforts. Here on this slide, you can see a 1929 photo of the new Federal Fingerprinting Division and a photo of an officer in the newly professionalized New York Police Department. These are emblems of law enforcement's modernization and expansion in the early 20th century. Religious leaders actively participated in this new anti-crime consensus and urged Christian support for modernizing and expanded law enforcement. Here you can see a variety of newspaper clippings and images detailing religious dimensions of early 20th century law and order, from articles and photos hailing the presence of Protestants and Catholics in the New York police to an announcement for a Law and Order Sunday. Politicians of all stripes welcomed this kind of religious engagement. As Franklin Roosevelt's Attorney General, Homer Cummings, put it in one speech, the role of religion in crime prevention was obvious. American law and order in the early 20th century was not only a religious cause, however. It was also embedded in a racial imagination. Black Americans were no longer enslaved, but their skin color marked them as criminals in the eyes of many white Americans. Black people were viewed as more likely to commit crimes because of their race and were seen by many white Americans as more likely to ignore crime in their own neighborhoods. The idea that Black Americans were inherently criminal helped underwrite punitive responses by both law enforcement and lynch mobs. There was, as the historian Khalil Muhammad has written, a widespread condemnation of blackness, one that helped underwrite the criminalization and arrest of Black people. One famous example of this was the case of the Scottsboro Boys, pictured here, who were falsely accused of rape of a white woman, imprisoned in Alabama in the 1930s, and freed after several years only because of tremendous national outcry. White Christians contributed to this narrative as well. Let me show you two examples that center on the matter of lynching. In the late 19th century, whites, especially those in the South, began to look for new ways to exert control of Black people after emancipation, and Southern states began to pass laws restricting Black participation in public life, and Southern whites began to speak of the need of redemption of the South from Black and Northern influence. Lynching and the threat of mob violence became ways to control and punish African Americans, not only for violating the law, but for overstepping the bounds of the segregated Jim Crow social order. Between 1882 and 1968, there were around 4,743 recorded lynchings, the majority of them Black men and women. As scholars such as Donald Matthews and James Cone have shown, lynchings operated as religious events. Not only would many, perhaps most, of the participants in a lynching have identified as Bible-believing Christians, but perpetrators of lynchings routinely mobilized theological concepts of sin, sacrifice, and atonement to explain their actions. Lynching was frequently framed as a kind of blood sacrifice, with the blood of victims cleansing the land of sin and perpetrators shouting phrases like, "Glory to God," while they killed their victims. One Georgia newspaper recognized the religious ritual power here in a headline that announced, "Lynching is part of the religion of our people." Not all American Protestants supported lynchings, but some who refused to endorse the practice still saw it as a sad necessity given their views of African Americans' inherent criminality. In 1904, a Baptist minister named John Roach Stratton wrote an article in a major national magazine that pointed to the increased number of lynchings of African Americans as proof not of rampant white supremacist violence, but of rising Black criminality. He contended that Black crime rates, which he saw as disproportionately high, were evidence that Black people were not ready to accept the burdens of freedom following their enslavement. The minister said, "We take these savages from their simple life and their low plane of evolution and attempt to give them an enlightenment for which the stronger races have prepared themselves through ages of growth. Like little children in a tropical garden, they eat all fruit merely because it looks pretty or tastes sweet." Reverend Stratton's argument here was that black people were not suited to modern American society, and that there was some sort of inherent racial flaw that kept them from obeying the law. For him, that was why there were so many lynchings. The implication here was that black criminality justified then the increased policing of black people. Stratton would go on to become a well-known conservative Protestant pastor, and he would continue to draw on similar sentiments in his public ministry during the 1920s as he regularly pushed for more law and order. This racist assumption that black Americans were somehow inherently prone to criminality underlay a good deal of law and order rhetoric and worries about rising crime. And it put black Christians in a bind. Many black Christian leaders were also worried about crime, and some spoke of their own desire for expanded law enforcement. These leaders often focused on the crimes of lynching and the crimes of white supremacist violence, and at times urged the nation to consider the fact that Jesus' own crucifixion was itself a kind of unjust lynching. But what these black leaders wanted was assurance of the rule of law, a guarantee that they would be protected from the crimes committed and regularly overlooked by a white supremacist social order, and that they could receive fair treatment by police and courts of law. But by talking up crime as a social problem, black Christian leaders risked playing into the racist assumptions about black criminality operative among many of their white brethren. Also, many black Christians were not only interested in expanding the role of law enforcement, they also wanted to secure more just policies that would benefit their communities economically and help them attain more equality in housing, schools, and public life more generally. But this broader vision of uplift was often ignored by white politicians in favor of an approach that prioritized law and order alone. A second example of Christian concern about matters of crime can be seen a few decades later amidst the emergence of a new evangelical movement in the 1940s and 50s. Here, evangelical leaders were growing in appeal and influence as they preached a culturally savvy gospel to a nation anxious about the prospects of global conflict with communism. The years following World War II were also an age of massive concern about crime and especially delinquency. Evangelicals worked to build off these concerns, and their rhetoric and their activism on crime and delinquency became a part of their entry into American public life. No evangelical was more influential here than Billy Graham. A celebrity evangelist who became famous for his international crusades that attracted thousands, Graham regularly spoke of crime and delinquency as major issues of Christian concern. He routinely talked about such concerns at his evangelistic crusades. He visited prisons, including one widely covered visit to San Quentin Prison in California in 1958. He met with urban youth gangs and even sought out photo ops with them. Graham's ministry also released a feature film called Wiretapper, about the Christian conversion of a Los Angeles gangster named Jim Voss, an actual person, who had been converted at Graham's 1949 LA crusade. Jim Voss would go on to write books about his crime to Christ conversion and would develop his own ministry to at-risk youth in New York. This is a poster of the film Wiretapper. You can watch it. It's on YouTube, or at least it was a few years ago. It's, you know, a good Friday night movie to check out. The poster makes it look more exciting than it actually is, but it's fun. Also ministering in New York at mid-century was Assemblies of God pastor David Wilkerson, who had felt a call from God to move from rural Pennsylvania to the city after reading a Life magazine article about teenage gang members going on trial for murder. Though his initial attempts to evangelize these boys were thwarted by a judge and unsympathetic press, Wilkerson was not deterred. He returned to preach to gangs in Brooklyn and to hold evangelistic rallies, eventually persuading gang leaders to trade their weapons in for Bibles and to join him in ministry. A few years later, he developed a full-fledged ministry organization, Teen Challenge, that initially focused on outreach to street gangs and later would make drug rehabilitation its primary concern. Wilkerson would write about this early ministry work in a book called The Cross and the Switchblade, which became a massive bestseller. Also a movie of that, starring Pat Boone. For evangelicals like Graham, Jim Voss, and David Wilkerson, crime and delinquency were examples of America's growing problems of sin and secularity. But in a break with past generations of Protestants, the answer for these evangelicals was not harsher punishment, or more lynch mobs, or police, but for criminals to make decisions for Christ. Indeed, Wilkerson's Cross and the Switchblade, even though it has a fixation on the problems of drugs and crime in the city, is remarkable for what it doesn't prescribe: the arrest and punishment of offenders. Instead, conversion was the true solution. And the result of these conversions, these evangelists argued, would be a widespread revival that would also decrease America's crime rate. This was an approach that ignored larger systemic problems of poverty and racism, to be sure, but it was also one that saw offenders as bearing the image of God, being worthy of love, and able to change. Indeed, Billy Graham carried this kind of concern with him for the rest of his life. When he died in 2018, he was buried in a wooden casket built by incarcerated men from Angola Prison in Louisiana. However, there was a different evangelical approach to crime issues that emerged at mid-century as well, one that moved away from simple conversion and forgiveness to a tougher vision of justice. This brand of crime concern was evident in more politically engaged evangelical quarters at mid-century, such as in the brand new magazine Christianity Today, which had been launched in 1956, and Graham had been influential in launching the magazine. Christianity Today regularly spoke of problems of crime and delinquency in its early issues, as it attempted to stake a claim on evangelical understanding and involvement in American public life. The magazine even featured regular commentary and opinion pieces written by FBI head J. Edgar Hoover. The approach of Christianity Today was less focused on conversion of lawbreakers and more on the development of political solutions to crime. In effect, the bolstering of the criminal justice system and empowerment of state law enforcement responses like Hoover's FBI, tasked with fighting lawbreaking. And increasingly, amidst the revolutionary years of the 1960s, evangelicals would begin to downplay their earlier conversionist responses with a renewed vision of law and order, a call for an increase in capital punishment, and expanded police presence in American cities. As one official at the National Association of Evangelicals wrote on the matter of capital punishment a few years later, and perhaps an echo of a sentiment common in an earlier lynching era, God does not forgive sin without appropriate penalties. This alternative, more punitive evangelical approach solidified in the responses to urban uprisings of the mid to late 60s. One famous uprising was in 1965 in the predominantly black Los Angeles neighborhood of Watts. There, residents had long complained of the LAPD's brutal behavior and racism, and everything spilled over in the midst of a confrontation between police and a man they had stopped for erratic driving. A crowd gathered and a scuffle started amongst residents fed up with police mistreatment, and this eventually turned into a massive uprising with scores of police and National Guard soldiers mobilizing to stop the violence. Some Christian leaders, such as Martin Luther King Jr., urged attention to the unjust conditions and racism that had prompted uprisings like Watts, as well as the nation's collective responsibility. As King famously said, "A riot is the language of the unheard." By contrast, white evangelicals like Billy Graham had a different message. In the midst of the uprising, Graham preached, "We need salvation from lawlessness." But in a break from much of his evangelistic preaching before this point, he urged Congress to pass tough new penalties for lawbreaking. For white evangelicals like Graham, increasingly the answer to the unrest in America's cities was not a reckoning with racism or police violence. It was not even Christian conversion of individual souls. Instead, it was more law and order. Evangelicals like Graham increasingly allied with law and order politicians from the mid-60s on, such as Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. These politicians capitalized on crime concern and evangelical support as they engineered more punitive policies that would put more and more people behind bars. Politicians found an evangelicalism that was increasingly hungry for law and order politics, so much so that it affected their own seemingly non-political approaches to other concerns. This was the context that helped make possible an evangelical fascination with control and of discipline, of society and of families. Indeed, Dr. James Dobson's landmark 1970 work, Dare to Discipline, which would sell millions of copies and go through numerous printings, was written, he noted, as a response to, quote, "widespread drug usage, immorality, civil disobedience, vandalism, and violence," end quote. The book, which had an entire chapter on drug abuse that Dobson had written with assistance from the LAPD, found its way into the Nixon White House library in 1972. Though family values would be the touchstone issue for many evangelicals into the 70s and 80s, it was discipline, born out of fear of disorder, that was likewise a marker of evangelical social concern. This brings me to my second overall point. The first, if you remember, was that concerns about crime in modern America have often been animated by religious ideas and actors, in particular evangelical Protestants. The second point is this. As evangelical Christians lobbied for more law and order, they also helped to make these changes appealing to other citizens. A key way they did this was by bolstering law enforcement's seemingly neutral or even humanitarian quality, its respectable status, and crucially, its colorblind aspirations. Evangelicals from the late 60s on stressed that police were there to serve communities and that law enforcement could have a positive relationship with minority neighborhoods. You can see here one artifact from the late 60s in California that exemplifies both the religious vision of law and order and the stress on police as racially sensitive, community-focused state actors. These are images from a booklet from the California Governor's Office juxtaposing white families at prayer and black children being policed. Elsewhere, the booklet references Bible verses to contend for everyday citizens to get active on the crime issue as good Samaritans for their state. The images of kind police and humanitarian good Samaritan language indicated that the work of American law enforcement could be framed in ways that went beyond a simplistic punitive or retributive approach. This was not the first time policing had been framed this way. Earlier in the 20th century, Christians praised the humanitarian possibilities of policing. And this point was made by both progressives and conservative Christians. For instance, Charles Sheldon, the social gospel icon who coined the phrase, "What would Jesus do?" wrote regularly of his hope that Christians could serve as what he called missionary police to urban slums. He argued that these missionary police could operate without prejudice, for they would gain cultural sensitivity through training and by living as a part of the communities they served. Sheldon's hopes foreshadowed later practices like community policing, a reformist approach that emerged in the late 60s and 70s, which purported to train and deploy police to have better relationships with the neighborhoods they patrolled. Evangelicals were proponents of community policing, including the LAPD assistant chief, who was an evangelical Christian and a vocal booster of the practice. Evangelicals from the 1970s to the present also launched ministries to police officers and produced films and books, like some of the ones you can see here, that defended law enforcement, justified it theologically as a godly vocation of community service. Policing, framed by these humanitarian, community, and Christian appeals, embedded law enforcement all the more deeply within neighborhoods and within the popular religious imagination. But since the neighborhoods being policed were disproportionately poor, urban neighborhoods with minority residents, it guaranteed that those who would be surveilled and arrested would disproportionately be poor people of color. At the same time, evangelical stress on policing as an idealized sacred response to social problems also limited their ability to see other possible responses to crime as valid, such as public investment in education or mental health. Here's one example of this. When evangelicals wanted to justify the work of policing, they often turned to the Bible, in particular Romans 13:4, a verse where Paul writes concerning Roman government leaders, "For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer." This biblical reference was quite common in law enforcement circles from the 60s to the present, and you can see here how this verse was often deployed with police aesthetics. You can also see here on the right a few other examples of modern police Bibles that have similar aesthetics and messaging. In fact, this framing went beyond law enforcement to the broader public. The Living Bible, a popular paraphrase and the best-selling book in the US in 1973 and 74, even inserts the word policeman into its rendering of Romans 13. For the policeman does not frighten people who are doing right, but those doing evil will always fear him. So if you don't want to be afraid, keep the laws and you will get along well. The policeman is sent by God to help you. But if you are doing something wrong, of course you should be afraid, for he will have you punished. He is sent by God for that very purpose. The biblical framing here does at least two things. It suggests that officers are indeed servants of God and of the public, protecting the social order and those who are weak and defenseless. But the verse, with its reference to the sword, its regular presence in pro-police media, also suggests that officers have divine authority to use violence. Whether or not this is even a good interpretation of Romans 13 is beside the point, but I should mention evangelical scholars such as Esau Macaulay have offered interpretations that frame the passage differently in terms of its limiting quality and checking the divine pretensions of the state. But however we want to read it, we should think about the implications of use of this passage for bolstering the power of the police. This brings me to my final point. As law and order politics, bolstered by the empowerment of policing, ascended to new heights in the 1970s and after, evangelicals were at the forefront of crafting responses to the problems of growing prisons. A small number were highly critical. One popular black evangelical named Tom Skinner, pictured here, blasted law and order evangelicals like Billy Graham. What white evangelicals actually mean by law and order, Skinner declared in a 1970 speech at the Urbana Conference, is all the order for us and all the law for them. Skinner said that the police in the black community have become nothing more than the occupational force for the purpose of maintaining the interests of white society. And Skinner had a hard word for Christians who wanted to focus on simply preaching the gospel, who thought he was getting too political or controversial and focusing on these issues. For these Christians, those who saw moderation or a spiritual focus as the priority, Skinner had a message. There is no possible way you can talk about preaching the gospel, he said, if you do not want to deal with the issues that bind people. But trenchant criticisms like these were dismissed by most white evangelicals. Instead, the response of many evangelicals in the 1970s and after was to seek out a middle ground between tough-on-crime politicking and critical protest of law and order. This middle ground was prison ministry. Evangelicals flooded prisons from the 1970s on, hosting evangelistic events, distributing Bibles, and developing ministries focused on incarcerated people. Evangelical prison ministries exhibited profound concern with the plight of incarcerated people, but generally downplayed critical questions about law and order politics or racial and economic disparities within prisons. In an echo of Billy Graham and David Wilkerson's efforts from the 1950s, they focused instead on soul-saving and spiritual care as the ultimate solutions to crime and personal sin. One exception was the prison ministry of Charles Colson, pictured here. Colson had formerly been a ruthless advisor to Richard Nixon before going to prison himself for various Nixon administration illegalities. Before his trial, Colson was born again in a dramatic Christian conversion experience. The combination of Colson's newfound faith and a testing prison experience led him to found Prison Fellowship in 1976, which soon became the world's largest prison ministry. Colson realized that preaching the gospel in prison would not be enough. From his own incarceration, he had seen firsthand their horrific, overcrowded conditions, and he knew that reform of some kind was necessary. His conservative evangelical justice reform work from the early 80s up to his death in 2012 was a subtle critique of both punitive law and order politics and what Colson saw as the overweening power of the state. When Colson argued for humane treatment of prisoners, he framed his arguments as an attack on the worst of progressive-style social engineering. At the same time, he pushed back against punitive, retributive politics. For the conservative Colson, the problem with the criminal justice system was not only that it was punitive, it was a big government program that didn't work. Colson understood that there was no better target for a conservative looking to do good than the nation's prison system, what Elliott Curry has called the most thoroughly implemented government social program of our time. Colson laid the foundation for the contemporary conservative criminal justice reform movement. This movement's biggest victory, in my opinion, was the First Step Act, passed in 2018 with bipartisan support in Congress and from the Trump administration. The act eased some mandatory minimums and three-strike sentencing rules and gave President Trump a signature domestic policy victory. However, the act was also routinely criticized for its modest scope. More generally, conservative criminal justice reform, like much of Colson's own activism, has been criticized for remaining too moderate and incrementally focused with regards to challenging mass incarceration, especially the racial inequalities within the justice system. So to conclude, I hope this history helps us make sense of some of what we've seen in recent years. The ways that themes of Christianity, crime, and punishment are frequently mobilized in our nation's public and religious discourse. Trump's Bible-wielding pro-police appeals were a reminder that law and order politics have long been religious, tailored to a white evangelical audience more often than not. But Trump's simultaneous advancement of criminal justice reform legislation heavily lobbied for by evangelicals, and his public highlighting of Christian converts, like the former bank robber John Ponder, showcases other kinds of evangelical influence. I would argue that this vision of God, law, and order is so powerful because it is so flexible and adaptable to a variety of contexts. Its flexibility allows advocates to appeal to a number of different political and religious constituencies at once, not only conservative white evangelicals. But I would also argue that we should note how this vision invests sacred power in America's justice system. And in doing so, it grants law enforcement and our nation's justice system a kind of divine authority that can limit our ability to think and act in fully transformative ways about crime, punishment, and prisons. Now, since we're at an event for the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism, I think we can ask this question. How should evangelicals think about this history and the tensions evident here and in our present moment? I can't pretend to offer an entirely comprehensive, constructive account, but I want to share a couple of quick thoughts. And these thoughts are born out of my own historical scholarship, but also my own story. To lay my cards on the table, I'm an evangelical Christian who cares about the church and its witness in American public life. I've volunteered in prison ministry myself, and I have been blessed by relationships with friends who are incarcerated. First, I hope problems with the linkage of Christian faith and law and order politics are evident based on the history I've put before you. A history of racism embedded within our society and justice system, and a history of the ways Christians have let fear of crime and disorder push us into punitive responses. But I also hope I've shown how this punitive sentiment is very flexible. The damage that over-policing and imprisonment can do to our communities is often concealed by humanitarian sentiment and colorblind language. Second, I hope this history has given us a sense of how moving forward Christians, and I would argue those who are concerned with Christian involvement in American public life, shouldn't be neutral on these issues. Some Christians may feel uncomfortable with contemporary law and order appeals and feel like this kind of rhetoric is in bad taste. But even if they're uncomfortable with aggressive law and order politicking, Christians can be easily tempted to see these matters as secondary, issues that should be deprioritized in favor of more spiritual or churchy matters. Similarly, those outside of evangelical communities or those who are worried about evangelicals and their influence in American public life might wish the same for evangelicals, that they would simply focus on spiritual and churchy matters and avoid public engagement, either because of seemingly inappropriate mixing of religion and politics or because evangelicals' track record is suspect. I would encourage both camps to listen to the voice of Tom Skinner, who I mentioned earlier, who protested not only white Christian support of law and order, but also Christians' unwillingness to advocate directly for those who have borne the brunt of punitive politics. Skinner said that there is no possible way you can talk about preaching the gospel if you do not want to deal with the issues that bind people. I think Skinner was right. The issues that bind people are indeed gospel issues. Especially if you're a Christian who is part of a community or tradition that claims reconciliation and the protection of human life as theological goods, I would encourage us to think about how we orient ourselves to the prospect of violence, not only in times of war or with regards to the protection of the unborn, but how we consider the state violence, both real and potential, that occurs in our nation every day, and its policing and imprisonment of our fellow citizens and divine image bearers. It was planned. People are falling over. This is not only a question of one's theory of politics or of the state. This is a relational question. This is a question of love of neighbor. It's a question of the common good, of Christians' obligations to the earthly city, even as we long for a heavenly one. Those in our nation who constantly face surveillance, arrest, and the possibility of violence by police, immigration enforcement, or even private citizens, these are all people made in the image of God. You may have heard some of these names before, perhaps. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, or more recently, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the man who was mistakenly deported to a massive prison in El Salvador by the Trump administration, despite never being convicted of a crime. To not say these people's names or to take their concerns, their stories, their arrests, sometimes their deaths seriously in our churches demonstrates not only a failure to reckon with a long history of how religion, racism, and law and order have worked hand in hand in our nation. In my view, for Christians, it also risks denying Jesus' command to love our neighbors. As Jennifer Vasquez Sura, wife of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, said in a press conference 34 days after his disappearance, "Kilmar, stay strong. God hasn't forgotten about you." At its best, whether in prison ministry or prison reform work, evangelicals' engagement in American criminal justice can make that same claim. God hasn't forgotten about you. But as Jennifer Vasquez Sura shows us, when we make that kind of claim, we have to pay attention to the political context, the politics that make systems and acts of incarceration, of putting human beings in cages, possible. I'm going to finish by reading the final 2 paragraphs of my book. I wrote these about 5 or 6 years ago, but I think they still fit our contemporary moment. Today, evangelicals continue to pursue fellowship with offenders, visit and write letters to those on the inside, head up programs to bring Christmas presents to the children of prisoners, and welcome formerly incarcerated people into their churches and workplaces. These are all legacies of the 1970s prison ministry surge. This is work, as Billy Graham's casket carpenters put it, that shows the love of God and the promise of redemption. If evangelicals do manage to participate in the dismantling of America's system of mass incarceration, it will likely be because they have continued to invest in and learn from experiences like these. Experiences that can interrupt the seemingly natural order of punitive politics and gesture toward an alternative way of life built on grace, restoration, and second and third and fourth chances. If this way of life is to be more than just a gesture, however, evangelicals must not restrict the radical political implications of proximity, prayer, and friendship with fellow believers on the inside. After all, God's incarnational ministry not only began with Jesus' declaration that the Spirit of the Lord was now upon him, but also as he told the gathered crowd that the Spirit had sent him to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, Luke 4:18. As it did with Jesus, this work may push American evangelicals to be at odds with the spirits of the age, particularly if it means confronting head-on the ways race remains determinative in coding perceptions of criminality. For evangelicals already engaged in prison ministry work, this call should not be too burdensome. Even if they're not politically active, most prison ministers today know something is wrong in American criminal justice. They want to see prisoners treated humanely and restored to society, and they know that it's a problem that the incarcerated people with whom they work are disproportionately the poor and people of color. For other evangelicals, particularly those who feel the pull of law and order politics, proclaiming freedom to the captives will be a taller order. There will need to be, as death penalty activist and evangelical Christian college graduate Brian Stevenson has argued, widespread repentance of past punitive sins. This will be hard for evangelicals who want to believe in their movement's internal integrity and a timeless gospel witness. But repentance like this might better be seen as a conversion, and conversions are what evangelicals do best. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I got a question for you. From a prison abolition perspective,
Yeah.
that movement argues that most of the history of what's gone on with the prison in America has been a back and forth dialectic between tough on crime and let's reform, tough on crime and let's reform.
Yeah.
And one of the things I found very interesting about your talk was that within this group we often think of as so aligned with the right. You can see that dialectic going on
Yeah.
within that group.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if you know of any abolition movements within what you're thinking of as evangelicalism, particularly because the kind of thing that Skinner is preaching and that you're talking about at the end seems to get closer to abolition than reform.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I'll just note that evangelicals today like to call themselves abolitionists, but they don't, or they like to point to their historical roots in abolitionist movements with regards to chattel slavery. And it's interesting how they haven't picked up abolition, as you note, in the same way with regards to contemporary carceral, stuff. I think there's a couple of moves though that give me, whether you're abolitionist or not, they're moves that I think are compelling for any number of reasons that some evangelicals have been very influential within. The first is restorative justice movements. So I didn't talk about this in my talk. I wanted to fit it in, but just too much going on. But Chuck Colson in the 1980s, he does not invent restorative justice at all, but he is someone that makes it really popular and uses restorative language and restorative practices and tries to persuade politicians that this is something they should take seriously as an alternative to harsh punishment in prisons. Restorative justice, if you're not familiar with it, it can mean lots of different things, but generally speaking, it's an approach to harms done that center the needs of victims and communities that both victims and offenders are connected with. And it is much less interested in sort of balancing the scales and sort of punitive, retributive punishment as sort of a metaphysical kind of accomplishment, and more just asking, like, what does the victim need in this moment? What harm has been done? What does it mean for this offender who may have done something really harmful? What does it mean for them to repair and restore? Colson and a couple of other evangelicals become advocates of restorative justice in the 80s, and the problem they face is that it is so hard to institute restorative practices in American law. Just even thinking about the ways our courts are set up and the ways that prosecutors do the work that they do, it's just very difficult. But some of that work persists. I've talked to a number of evangelical reformers, in the last few years, and a lot of them have a lot of hope in restorative kinds of practices. Some pushing for towards an abolitionist horizon, others saying, I'm not abolitionist, but I think restorative justice is the right way to go. The second thing that I would say, though, is that I think there is an awareness among evangelical justice reformers of how reform can happen in more helpful ways. I'm resisting the term abolitionist here because they aren't using that word. But when Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about non-reformist reforms, Ruth Wilson Gilmore is a famous prison abolitionist. People will sometimes come to her and say, well, are you against reforming the justice system? And she'll say, no, I just want reforms that don't accept the status quo. I want us to make changes that are non-reformist in their aspirations. That may be very small and incremental, but that push towards ultimately a world where we don't rely on these systems. I think evangelicals have advocated for some of that kind of stuff. Other times they don't. It's complicated. There is, I think, since 2020, there are, and I tried to point this out with some of the signs I showed here, there are a lot of religious folks, Christians, who are really interested in abolitionist politics and not necessarily sold on it, but are like open to it. I think that we're in this like moment where it was like really popular like nationally for a year or two after 2020, and now it's kind of in this more complex moment. And so I'll be very interested in the coming years how whether it gains and has traction with it or not. But yeah. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to phrase this. Now, this stems from my lack of knowledge of the criminal justice system and my total tendency toward literalness. When I hear law and order, I think, yes, that's the lack of lawlessness and chaos, such as we are seeing at the top of our government at this time. And I'm all for more law and order. It's coded language for something that I don't, in my literal mind, understand. So can you help me out?
That's a great question. I mentioned this earlier with regards to African American Christians who are engaged in this sort of early 20th century like crime activism. And a lot of what they are arguing for is the rule of law. They would say that we should have these laws and people should follow them, and that we should not see them as optional, which sounds like so basic, like that's what law is, but that guarantee is often not been assured for many people in throughout American history. There was not a guarantee that even though a lynching was against the law, that you would be protected from a mob, right? If you were Black in the South. So I think maybe that's like the distinction I would want to make even today is rule of law is super important, whether you're talking about lynch mobs in the late 19th, early 20th century, or whether you're talking about like the executive branch doing what courts say they have to do today. That's different, it seems to me, whether in categorically or in emphasis, than law and order, which law and order has this much more amorphous, and it is something that politicians, it's a kind of rhetoric and a sort of actually an investment in systems of punishment, policing, surveillance, that sometimes actually end up being make it more likely that people do violate the rule of law, that it makes life more dangerous for people that are over-policed, communities that do face the brunt of over-policing, over-criminalization. That's a distinction I'd want to make. I'm very interested, though, in this moment, and I think we saw this in the first Trump administration, where he is in this kind of like rhetorical bind at times, where he is both trying to hail law enforcement, at the same time he's like ripping on the FBI. And it's interesting. I don't quite know what to make of that, like what long-term that will mean for how those institutions function. It's also been, at the same time, interesting to watch progressives like take the FBI's side, and say like, oh, this timeless institution of justice. It's like, did you pay attention like 50s and 60s, like what was going on? And so it sort of cuts both ways. Like to watch people opposed to Trump now all of a sudden want to talk more of a game with regards to law enforcement. And this is 2024, like the campaign, like what Harris tried to do, right? Was say, I'm a prosecutor, I do this work. And that's kind of my part of my argument here is how Americans of all political persuasions invest themselves into this way of thinking. So, yeah. Yeah.
They've reworded this question multiple times, okay. So I'm doing my absolute best to make this make sense.
Great.
Do you feel that evangelicals are playing a role in the rhetoric of consolidating power under the executive branch? And if yes, how so?
Yes.
That's why I reworded it.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the evangelical Christian, and evangelical is a complicated term in this kind of conversation, but we'll just go with it. Evangelical support of Trump, in spite of what many people have said are his non-evangelical habits, dispositions, etc. I think that there is, like we're seeing a new kind of investment in not just the executive branch, but in this like authoritarian personality that maybe is analogous to that kind of sacred power that I pointed to with reference to Romans 13 of, to put it somewhat crudely, like might makes right. At the same time, though, I'm also struck by how a lot of evangelicals, not the majority, but a lot of them are uncomfortable with this. You have people, a minority report, we might say, people like David French, who are in the New York Times like twice a week, making this exact claim, saying, this is a problem, I'm an evangelical, like let's pay attention here. And that is being sidelined as like the, as the sort of mainstream opinion. And so, but I think it's worth pointing out that both of those arguments are happening at the same time. I'm not really interested in deciding which one's the real evangelical one. I don't think that's a good question as much as look at what's both happening and potentially how could one change or not. This is the work of scholars like Kristen Dumais. Kristen Dumais has done great work in her book Jesus and John Wayne and making the argument like Trump is a feature, not a bug of modern American evangelical history. I think that's right. I also think though that there is that actually evangelicals throughout the 20th century have tacked closer to like the quote main of American politics than maybe sometimes we give them credit for. That it's less of a backlash and it's much more that they have invested and learned how to talk in conversations with people different than themselves, for better or worse. So, yeah, that's a very long-winded answer to a very succinct, good question. So, thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure what my question is yet, but when she was talking about, you were talking about rule of law and kind of going on with what you were just saying too, was I thought of Martin Luther King Jr. He spoke about, the difference between the just law and unjust law.
Yeah.
And so just maybe asking you about that, like what you think of that as far as how can we move toward making better, more just laws? Because I think if we had just laws, maybe we wouldn't see the problems that the resistance and the
Yeah. So that comes. I mean, King says that in multiple places, and we've got Paul Harvey here, who's a King scholar, so he can correct me if I'm wrong about this. But when King says that in Letter from Birmingham Jail, what's interesting to me is that he's drawing on like a rich Christian tradition directly of how Christians from the entire history of the faith have like wrestled with the same question. Augustine, Aquinas. He is not saying this is like a willy-nilly thing, and he's definitely not saying like it's easy to tell, but he also says, look at what's happening to these people. Look at what he says in the letter, like, my daughters, the trauma that they face when they can't go to the amusement park with me, like white children. There is something like deep in our souls that we know that that's wrong, and that does not accord with the natural law of the universe, the moral law. I feel like we just aren't even having that kind of conversation right now in American politics at all. Like that really deep introspective sense of like, what is actually good? What does it mean to be a human being? Are we living in ways that dignify one another and that recognize the image of God? We're not. This is just like cheap shot social media and party politics on all sides of things. And I think that that's where I would want to go is like, do what King says in that letter, both in not only noticing that there's a difference between human and divine law, and that should give us humility, but that there are ways when we reason together with attention to those deep truths of what it means to be a human being and what it means what God has done, that we can maybe try to get closer to figuring it out.
I just find it a very interesting follow-up question. Because on those lines, you try to speak to somebody that you know, and you think that you should be on the same kind of wavelength about this is just, and this is not just. And suddenly you're like on opposite sides of an issue. They're like, how are we disagreeing about this? And this is among other Christians or evangelicals, and this is where I'm finding myself sometimes in daily conversation.
Yeah.
So.
Me too. Yeah. So I'll just go for a second on this with reference to criminal justice stuff. Policing, the death penalty, prisons, legal procedure, all that's really complicated, hard stuff. And I'm not pretending that it's just obvious what the answers are. But starting with, and I'd actually say that this is where David Wilkerson was onto something. Starting with the recognition that this is a human being who God made, who is somebody's child, and that they potentially might be put in a cage. That is a very important thing to remember, that is what we do in this country. We take people made in the image of God and we put them in cages. I'm not saying that there is an easy way to build policy from that and to, I'm recognizing the complications there, but I think the humility born out of the moral seriousness and theological seriousness of something like that, and that that all of us are responsible, that our tax dollars are doing that, is worth just reflecting on. And we're not reflecting on it in American politics today. We use it as a cudgel to just say, these people are bad, it's okay that we mistreat them or whatever, who cares? Instead, we should think deeply and with one another about those kinds of implications. And that's hard to do. I think churches, religious communities outside of Christianity are great places to do that kind of reflection and to think about our obligations there. My hope is that those become the places, rather than Twitter or whatever, that we can actually do that. So yeah, X, not Twitter. Yeah. Yes.
So perhaps it's the venue and therefore the nature of your research, but it seems to me that the case that evangelicals have created or have contributed to mass incarceration is overstated in what you're saying tonight. And part of the reason I'm asking that is, for example, you get the crime bills in the 1990s,
Yep.
which were bipartisan.
Yep.
Joe Biden was a huge part of this. He was not playing to an evangelical constituency. He coins the term drug czar. So there's, so I think there's a reality of people being concerned about crime, 70s, 80s in particular. People are concerned after the Miranda ruling of '66, right? So, criminals are not being held to account. Violent criminals are getting away with things, how true that is, but that's at least the perception. And I also wonder, it seems to me that pop culture would have a greater impact on people being concerned about crime. You know, in the 70s, you get Kojak and the French Connection, you know, and like the gritty New York City, overrun by crime, drama, movie, those things are really taking off in the 70s and 80s. More people are watching that than are listening to Billy Graham or Tom Skinner, right?
But
so
the
I mean,
cross and the switchblade is that. Like,
it is that, right? It's a part of that, but it's also not being watched as much as Popeye Doyle, right? I mean, it's got an audience, but it's you know, it's a very niche audience in some respects. You know, we have to wait a few years before Eric Estrada joins Chips, you know, as part of the, you know, it's a break, but it's not his really big break yet. So I mean, it just seems to me that more people would be paying attention to pop culture and concern. I mean, just even watching the news. The Bronx is burning in 1978. Son of Sam is on the loose and no one can catch him. So it just seems that would be a greater impact on people wanting a crime bill than you know, Christianity Today, which has a very small audience by comparison.
yeah, fair enough. So a couple of things. This is always the problem with like religious history, or any kind of history that's trying to isolate forms of influence. So I recognize the challenge here. What I'm not saying is that evangelicals invented mass incarceration or are the culprit that help us unlock where this all came from. Because you're exactly right. Like, there are so many other communities, factors, political moments that are also really important. Although I will say that some of those moments you mentioned, evangelicals are, and if you want to learn more, you can read the book, but evangelicals are very active in some of those moments in interesting ways. You know, so like when you have Miranda, when you have Matt v. Ohio, like these sort of Warren Court moments where they're trying to decide on like what the rights of defendants should be or people in police custody should be. Like, evangelicals are writing and arguing about that all the time in like American public life. And Christianity Today, which is read by like, they have an enormous subscriber base at this time because Pew has given them all this money to send the magazine to every pastor in America from the late 50s on. Christianity Today, we think of it today as more of maybe a more moderate evangelical magazine that's less political. In this moment, they're talking about Matt v. Ohio. They're talking about Miranda v. Arizona and like what the evangelical or the Christian position should be on those issues. And they're concluding mostly that offenders and defendants, just coined a new legal term, that they have too many rights, that we're not giving police enough power, that we're letting criminals out who are actually guilty. So just to note, I do think that you can note particular points of influence, whether in culture, which does matter for how politics gets shaped, but also politics itself. When Billy Graham gives that sermon in the middle of the Watts riots in -- where he says we need tougher laws, that sermon gets cited in Congress by like politicians. When the crime bill is going, when Johnson's crime bill is, which becomes the Safe Streets Act, is getting argued about, evangelical congressmen are right there, like in that debate. And they are then going back to their constituents and saying like, see, I'm for law and order. I'm for being tough on crime. However, what do you do then with all these other non-evangelical inflections or movements? I think it's a great question. It's one of the reasons why in my current research, my next book, I'm looking at a lot of other religious communities that aren't evangelical and how they intersect with police departments, in particular Roman Catholics. Because, yeah, like if you're in Boston or New York in the late 19th, early 20th century, there's conservative Protestants there that are very influential in arguing about police stuff, but the actual force is Irish Catholic. I think though that from the 50s onward, like evangelicals, as they're trying to shape American public life, whether it's through pop culture, whether it's through politics itself, they're punching above their weight, I think would be my argument. And that things like the Cross and the Switchblade, which has that gritty, they totally market it this way. I mean, you saw the cover, right? It's like this very much this 60s, 70s, like the dangerous city, and look at this rural pastor, like, you know, trying to find his way in it. That gets, before that gets published, Wilkerson, there's parts of it that are published. I believe it's Good Housekeeping excerpts it. So it's being read by people who are not evangelicals, who are not Assemblies of God, Pentecostals like Wilkerson. There's a wide reach there. Same thing with Colson. Colson's Born Again book, incredibly popular. They make a movie out of it. He's someone that, and Graham too, that has like a larger resonance outside of evangelical communities that I think is worth pointing to, not only as like a inside baseball kind of thing, but as they're having impact on the larger culture. But it's a great question. It's one I wrestled with, and in some ways this is why I tried throughout my research and my talk tonight to say the key here is like consensus politics. Like evangelicals are working along with mainstream American political opinion. They're not a backlash, which is actually how I think most of us are inclined to understand evangelicals, as reacting against culture, as pushing back, as being a part of a culture war. I'm saying, I think they're actually like helping shape what a lot of us intuitively think is normal.
One more.
Do one more. I'm gonna, if anybody that hasn't asked a question yet, okay. Oh yeah, go for it.
Did your research take you into like looking at ways their theological frameworks were interacting with? I mean, like just to say like the evangelical position, but like the ways that their theological framework would shape over time, the interplay maybe between the culture and that's maybe too big for the last 2 minutes, but is that in your book or is that something kind of outside what you were researching?
It's such a hard question. I mean, this is why I tried to like show in the book and in the talk, like just all these moments where evangelical pop culture is like just super popular. That this is not just for people inside church, but this is stuff to be broadcast on television. It's pulp paperbacks that they want millions of people to read. And so I think that was where I tried to showcase that influence and interplay. There are also places where I think it is a very much an inside baseball kind of thing. Christianity Today kind of feels like that to me. Christianity Today, when you read like the early issues of it, it's like really academic and bookish and boring. And it's like, I can say this because I've written for them. But they are, they're having like a sort of conversation within the church, but they're trying to figure out how do we become relevant? How do we connect with culture? And so what do? They have J. Edgar Hoover write op-eds for them. That's what they do. And so that is like the place where those kinds of moments to me are really important for seeing, okay, this is how like influence beyond church works. So also probably J. Edgar Hoover didn't actually write the op-eds, he probably had somebody else do it, but his name was on it. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate you having me here.